October 16, 1946, in the early hours before dawn, 10 men walked to their deaths inside Nuremberg prison. These were not ordinary criminals. These were some of the most powerful figures of the Third Reich, architects of a regime that had plunged the world into its deadliest conflict. As they faced the gallows, each man had final moments to speak. Some begged for forgiveness, others maintained their defiance until the very end, and a few spoke words that would haunt the executioners for years to come. What did these men say in their final moments? How did the masterminds of genocide face their ultimate judgment? Today, we'll examine the documented final statements of the condemned Nazi war criminals, recorded by Allied officials and witnesses present at these historic executions. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was unprecedented in human history. For the first time, leaders of a nation would be held accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Between November 1945 and October 1946, the world watched as evidence mounted against 24 major war criminals. Of those tried, 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. However, only 10 would ultimately face execution. Hermann Göring cheated the gallows by taking his own life in his cell just hours before his scheduled execution, while Martin Bormann was tried in absentia and remained missing, presumed dead. The executions were carried out by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, an American executioner who had volunteered for the grim duty. Each condemned man was brought individually to the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, which had been converted into an execution chamber. 3 gallows stood ready, and official witnesses, including journalists, military officials, and Allied representatives, documented everything. But what makes these final moments particularly significant is not just their historical importance, but the psychological window they provide into the minds of men who had wielded absolute power and were now facing absolute powerlessness. Hans Frank, once Hitler's personal lawyer and later the brutal governor-general of occupied Poland, was among the first to face execution that October morning. Frank had overseen the systematic murder of millions of Polish civilians and Jews, turning the general government into what he himself had called a devil's playground. In his final weeks, Frank had undergone what appeared to be a religious conversion, spending hours with the prison chaplain and claiming to have found redemption through faith. When brought to the gallows, Frank's demeanor was noticeably different from his arrogant courtroom appearances. The man who had once boasted about his role in the occupation now appeared subdued, almost broken. Frank's final statement was brief, but carried the weight of his claimed transformation. "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy," he said, his words reflecting what appeared to be genuine religious conversion. What made Frank's final moments particularly striking was the contrast between the man who had terrorized Poland and the apparently repentant figure who faced death. Prison guards reported that Frank had spent his final night in prayer, a stark departure from the ruthless administrator who had systematically dismantled Polish society. Yet questions remained about the sincerity of Frank's apparent conversion. Was this genuine remorse, or simply the desperation of a condemned man seeking absolution? The chaplain who attended him believed Frank's repentance was real, but others remained skeptical of such a convenient transformation. As Frank was prepared for execution, witnesses noted his calm demeanor, though his hands trembled slightly as the noose was placed around his neck. His final words before the trapdoor opened were spoken quietly, almost as a prayer. But Frank's case was just the beginning. The next condemned man would present an entirely different face of defiance in the shadow of death. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel represented the old Prussian military tradition, though his legacy was forever tainted by his complicity in war crimes. As chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, Keitel had signed numerous orders that violated the laws of war, including the infamous Commissar Order calling for the execution of captured Soviet political officers. Throughout the trial, Keitel had maintained that he was simply following orders, a soldier's duty to his superior. This defense, later known as the Nuremberg Defense, would be rejected by the tribunal, but Keitel never wavered from his position that military obedience was sacred. On the morning of his execution, Keitel's military bearing remained intact, Prison officials noted that he had maintained a strict personal discipline throughout his imprisonment, keeping to a rigid schedule and maintaining his physical fitness despite the circumstances. When brought to the gallows, Keitel walked with the measured pace of a soldier on parade. Witnesses described him as appearing almost relieved that his ordeal was finally ending. Unlike Frank's apparent spiritual transformation, Keitel showed no signs of religious awakening or personal remorse for his actions. Keitel's final statement reflected his unwavering belief in military honor, even in these final moments. "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany," he declared, maintaining his military bearing until the end. What struck witnesses most was Keitel's apparent inability to comprehend why military obedience was not accepted as a valid defense. To the end, he seemed to view himself not as a war criminal, but as a soldier who had done his duty. This disconnect between his self-perception and the reality of his crimes made his final moments particularly poignant. As the noose was adjusted, Keitel maintained his military posture, standing at attention even on the gallows. His final words were delivered with the same formal tone he had used when giving military briefings, a professional soldier to the very end. But if Keitel represented the military's blind obedience, the next condemned man embodied something far more sinister, the intellectual architect of racial ideology. Julius Streicher was different from the other condemned men. While others had held positions of military or administrative power, Streicher's weapon had been words. As the publisher of Der Stürmer, the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper, Streicher had poisoned German minds with racist propaganda for over 2 decades. During his imprisonment, Streicher had remained unrepentant and often belligerent. Guards reported that he frequently made inappropriate comments and seemed to take pleasure in provoking reactions. Unlike Frank's apparent conversion or Keitel's dignified resignation, Streicher maintained his hateful worldview until the end. On the morning of October 16th, Streicher's behavior was erratic and disturbing. As he was brought to the execution chamber, witnesses noted his agitated state and the wild look in his eyes. Prison officials had expected trouble from Streicher, and their concerns proved justified. Streicher's final moments were marked by defiance and continued hatred. Even facing death, he could not resist making inflammatory statements. His first words were, "Heil Hitler," shouted defiantly, followed by Purim Fest 1946, a reference to the Jewish holiday celebrating deliverance from persecution, and finally, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day." His hatred seemed to radiate from him, even as the noose was placed around his neck. What made Streicher's execution particularly unsettling for witnesses was his apparent satisfaction with his life's work. While other condemned men expressed regret or maintained dignified silence, Streicher seemed proud of his contribution to the Nazi cause. His final statement included predictions about the future that reflected his unwavering belief in his racial theories. The executioner, Master Sergeant Woods, later reported that Streicher's execution was among the most difficult he had performed, not due to technical problems, but because of the condemned man's disturbing behavior. Streicher's hatred seemed to radiate from him even as the noose was placed around his neck. As the trapdoor was prepared, Streicher made one final outburst that shocked even the experienced witnesses present. His words were so inflammatory that they were not included in many official reports, deemed too dangerous to preserve for history. Yet Streicher's defiant hatred would pale in comparison to the next condemned man, whose final words would reveal the depths of ideological fanaticism. Ernst Kaltenbrunner stood over 6 feet tall, his imposing physical presence matched by his role as one of the highest-ranking SS officers to survive the war. As chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Kaltenbrunner had overseen the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the intelligence service. He was directly responsible for the implementation of the final solution and countless other atrocities. Throughout the trial, Kaltenbrunner had maintained his innocence with cold, calculated denials. Unlike Streicher's emotional outbursts, Kaltenbrunner presented himself as a professional administrator who claimed ignorance of the crimes committed by his subordinates. His defense was methodical and legalistic, attempting to create plausible deniability for his involvement. On the morning of his execution, Kaltenbrunner's demeanor remained consistent with his courtroom behavior. Prison officials noted that he had spent his final night writing letters and organizing his personal effects with the same methodical approach he had brought to his bureaucratic duties. When brought to the gallows, Kaltenbrunner walked with measured steps, his tall frame imposing even in defeat. Witnesses described him as appearing almost analytical, as if he were observing the proceedings from a professional distance rather than participating as the condemned man. Kaltenbrunner's final statement was brief and maintained his protestations of innocence. He spoke of being a victim of circumstances and claimed that history would vindicate him. There was no acknowledgement of the millions who had died under his authority, no expression of remorse for the suffering he had caused. What struck witnesses most about Kaltenbrunner was his apparent emotional detachment. While other condemned men showed fear, defiance, or resignation, Kaltenbrunner seemed almost clinical in his approach to his own death. It was as if he were filing a final administrative report rather than facing execution. This cold professionalism had characterized Kaltenbrunner's entire career. He had approached mass murder with the same bureaucratic efficiency that others might bring to managing a business. His final moments reflected this disturbing ability to compartmentalize human suffering. As the noose was placed around his neck, Kaltenbrunner made one final statement that revealed his continued belief in his own righteousness. His words were delivered with the same flat, administrative tone he had used when signing death warrants for thousands of victims. But the clinical coldness of Kaltenbrunner would be followed by a very different kind of final statement, one that would reveal the personal fears beneath the Nazi facade. Fritz Sauckel had been responsible for one of the largest forced labor programs in human history. As plenipotentiary for labor deployment, he had overseen the deportation and enslavement of over 5 million foreign workers. These men, women, and children had been torn from their homes and forced to work in German factories under brutal conditions. During the trial, Sauckel had attempted to portray himself as a reluctant administrator who had tried to improve conditions for foreign workers. This defense crumbled under the weight of evidence showing his personal involvement in planning and implementing the slave labor program. Unlike some of his co-defendants, Sauckel had shown visible emotional distress throughout his imprisonment. Guards reported that he often appeared anxious and had difficulty sleeping. The man who had wielded enormous power over millions of lives seemed to struggle with his powerlessness in prison. On the morning of his execution, Sauckel's anxiety was apparent to all present. Witnesses noted his pale complexion and trembling hands as he was brought to the execution chamber. The confident administrator, who had managed a continent-spanning forced labor network, had been replaced by a frightened, broken man. Sauckel's final statement was markedly different from the defiant or coldly professional words of his predecessors. He spoke of his family and expressed fears about their future. There was a pleading quality to his words, as if he were still hoping for some last-minute reprieve. What made Sauckel's execution particularly poignant was his apparent realization of the human cost of his actions. While he never fully acknowledged his crimes, his final words suggested an understanding that he had caused immense suffering. This partial recognition of guilt set him apart from some of his more defiant co-defendants. The prison chaplain reported that Sauckel had sought spiritual counsel in his final weeks, though his religious conversion appeared less complete than Frank's claimed transformation. He seemed to be grasping for redemption while still struggling to fully accept responsibility for his crimes. As Sauckel stood on the gallows, his fear was palpable to witnesses. His final words were interrupted by his visible distress, and prison officials had to provide support to keep him standing. The man who had shown no mercy to millions of forced laborers was now pleading for mercy himself. Yet even Sauckel's fearful plea would be overshadowed by the next execution, that of a man whose final words would demonstrate the persistence of Nazi ideology, even in the face of death. General Alfred Jodl had been one of Hitler's closest military advisors, serving as Chief of Operations Staff of the High Command of the Armed Forces. His strategic mind had helped plan some of the war's most devastating campaigns, and his signature appeared on numerous orders that violated international law. Throughout the trial, Jodl had maintained his professional demeanor, presenting detailed defenses of his military decisions. Unlike Keitel's simple obedience defense, Jodl had attempted to justify his actions on strategic and tactical grounds, arguing that military necessity had dictated his choices. In his final weeks, Jodl had spent considerable time writing what he called his historical testament, a detailed justification of his wartime decisions. Prison officials noted that he approached this task with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his military planning. On the morning of his execution, Jodl appeared composed and thoughtful. Witnesses described him as looking like a professor about to deliver a lecture rather than a condemned man facing death. His intellectual approach to his situation was evident in his calm demeanor and measured movement. Jodl's final statement reflected his continued belief in the righteousness of his military service. He spoke of his duty to Germany and his conviction that future historians would understand the impossible situation he had faced. There was no acknowledgement of criminal wrongdoing, only a professional soldier's final briefing. What distinguished Jodl from other condemned officers was his intellectual approach to justifying his actions. While Keitel had relied on blind obedience and others had claimed ignorance, Jodl had crafted sophisticated arguments for his decisions. His final words continued this pattern of intellectual rationalization. Prison officials noted that Jodl had maintained correspondence with his wife until the end, and his final letters revealed a man who saw himself as a victim of political circumstances rather than a perpetrator of war crimes. This self-perception colored his final statement on the gallows. As the noose was prepared, Jodl delivered his final words with the precision of a military briefing. His tone remained professional and analytical, as if he were presenting a final strategic assessment rather than facing execution. The strategic mind that had planned military campaigns was now planning his own historical legacy. But Jodl's intellectual justifications would be followed by perhaps the most disturbing final statement of all, words that would reveal the depths of racist ideology that had driven the Nazi regime. Wilhelm Frick had been one of the Nazi Party's earliest members and had served as Reich Minister of the Interior. In this role, he had been instrumental in creating the legal framework for Nazi persecution, drafting laws that stripped Jews and other minorities of their civil rights and paved the way for genocide. During the trial, Frick had attempted to distance himself from the more violent aspects of Nazi policy, portraying himself as a legal administrator who had simply codified existing political decisions. This defense was undermined by evidence of his personal involvement in creating increasingly harsh persecution laws. In his final weeks, Frick had maintained the same legalistic approach that had characterized his defense. Prison officials reported that he spent much of his time organizing his papers and writing detailed explanations of his actions. His bureaucratic mindset remained intact, even facing death. On the morning of his execution, Frick appeared tired but composed. Witnesses noted that he walked to the gallows with the measured pace of a man attending a routine legal proceeding. The bureaucrat, who had systematically dismantled legal protections for minorities, approached his own death with administrative precision. Frick's final statement reflected his continued belief in the legality of his actions. He spoke of his role as a lawyer and administrator, claiming that he had simply followed proper legal procedures. There was no acknowledgement that laws themselves could be criminal when used to facilitate persecution and murder. What made Frick's execution particularly significant was his role in providing legal cover for Nazi atrocities. While others had implemented policy or commanded troops, Frick had created the legal framework that made systematic persecution possible. His final words showed no recognition of this fundamental corruption of law. The prison chaplain reported that Frick had shown little interest in spiritual matters, preferring to focus on legal and administrative concerns. His approach to death was as methodical and unemotional as his approach to creating persecution laws had been. As Frick stood on the gallows, his final words were delivered in the same dry, legalistic tone he had used throughout his career. The man who had perverted law to serve hatred maintained his bureaucratic demeanor to the very end, showing no understanding of the human cost of his legal architecture. Yet even Frick's cold legalism would be overshadowed by the final execution of the day, a man whose last words would encapsulate the independent core of Nazi ideology. Arthur Seyss-Inquart had been instrumental in the Nazi annexation of Austria and later served as Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands. In both roles, he had overseen brutal occupation policies that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, including the systematic deportation of Dutch Jews. Throughout the trial, Seyss-Inquart had maintained an attitude of intellectual superiority, arguing that his actions had been justified by historical necessity. Unlike some defendants who claimed ignorance or expressed regret, Seyss-Inquart seemed proud of his role in expanding Nazi control. In his final weeks, Seyss-Inquart had spent considerable time writing what he described as historical analyses of his actions. Prison officials noted that he approached his situation with the detachment of an academic, studying historical events rather than a condemned man facing death for his crimes. On the morning of his execution, Seyss-Inquart appeared calm and intellectually engaged. Witnesses described him as looking like a professor even on the gallows, maintaining the scholarly demeanor that had characterized his defense throughout the trial. Seyss-Inquart's final statement was perhaps the most chilling of all the executions that day. He expressed no remorse for his actions and maintained his belief in the historical necessity of Nazi policies. His words reflected an unshakable conviction that history would vindicate his role in the Nazi regime. What made Seyss-Inquart's final moments particularly disturbing was his apparent satisfaction with his life's work. While other condemned men had shown fear, defiance, or attempted justification, Seyss-Inquart seemed genuinely pleased with his contributions to Nazi goals. His intellectual arrogance remained intact even facing death. Prison officials noted that Seyss-Inquart had maintained extensive correspondence until the end, much of it focused on historical and political analysis rather than personal matters. His academic approach to his own execution was consistent with his scholarly pretensions throughout his imprisonment. As the final noose of the day was prepared, Seyss-Inquart delivered his last words with the confidence of a man who believed he had served a righteous cause. His statement reflected the intellectual arrogance that had characterized his entire career and revealed the depths of ideological commitment that had driven the Nazi regime. The executions were completed by 2:45 a.m. on October 16, 1946. The bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered in the Isar River to prevent any location from becoming a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. The final words of these men, recorded by official witnesses, became part of the historical record of the Nuremberg trials. What emerges from examining these final statements is not a single pattern, but rather a spectrum of human responses to ultimate judgment. Some men, like Frank, claimed religious conversion and expressed remorse. Others, like Keitel, maintained their professional dignity while failing to comprehend their crimes. Still others, like Streicher and Seyss-Inquart, remained defiant and unrepentant to the end. The psychological diversity of these final moments reflects the complex nature of the Nazi regime itself. The men executed at Nuremberg were not monsters from mythology, but human beings who had made choices that led to unprecedented evil. Their final words provide insight into how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary crimes. The executions at Nuremberg established important precedents for international justice. The principle that following orders is not a defense for war crimes, rejected in the cases of Keitel and Jodl, became a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. The documentation of these final moments serves as a historical record of how justice was administered to those responsible for the Holocaust and World War II's other atrocities. For the witnesses present that October morning, the executions represented the end of a dark chapter in human history. The final words of the condemned men, whether defiant, repentant, or coldly professional, became part of the permanent record of humanity's attempt to hold individuals accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The legacy of these executions extends far beyond the 10 men who died that day. The legal principles established at Nuremberg continue to influence international justice, and the detailed documentation of the proceedings, including the final statements of the condemned, serves as a historical resource for understanding how societies can descend into barbarism and how justice can be restored. The final words of these Nazi leaders, preserved in official records and witness accounts, remain a sobering reminder of the human capacity for both evil and justice. They stand as historical testimony to the consequences of unchecked power, the importance of individual moral responsibility, and the eventual triumph of justice over tyranny. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.